All right, we're here with Civil Disagreements with Jason and Brett, and today we got a pretty controversial topic. I think when we started this podcast, we pretty much wanted to tackle fairly controversial issues or issues that people disagree and demonize the other side with. And what better example have we seen of that in the last couple of weeks? None other than Donald Trump's fight and spat with the squad, quote unquote, the four more liberal congresswomen that have been having a spat with Nancy Pelosi in the last week. And I think this is one of those topics that people can get highly emotional about because it's about racism and, how you view other people or maybe minorities or people that disagree with you as well. The point of our podcast is to try to talk through some of these issues in a somewhat rational manner. And I think it's hard on these topics to not be emotional occasionally, but good people can kind of disagree with interpretations, and we're just going to do the best we can. Any introduction that you feel like talking about, Jason, in regards to just getting started here?
No, I mean, I think that's a good starting place. I think it definitely is. It's a controversial topic that people can be really emotional about. And so it can even feel intimidating to engage in a topic like this. And I think that's exactly what we're trying to do with this channel. I look forward to engaging and seeing where we end up.
Yeah, it's an intimidating topic because, I think depending on which side of the aisle that you fall on, or whether you think Donald Trump's a racist or not a racist, good people can kind of disagree or interpret things differently. I think this is a perfect example of really how different sides value different things and want to highlight certain things over the other, and they just talk past each other. So let's kind of get into it here. So the big, I guess, catalyst for this was Donald Trump's tweet. And granted, there's been a history between the four congresswomen and Nancy Pelosi and the leadership of the party. So I don't know if we want to spend a lot of time on that because we can really get into the weeds on it. But, Nancy Pelosi's kind of trying to control the party and control what some of the votes are, and trying to minimize a little bit the four Congresswomen: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib. I don't know the other two, honestly. Ilhan Omar, and do you know the other one?
Ivana Presley.
Okay, good call there. So they're, the squad, quote unquote, and back and forth. And Donald Trump tweeted this out on July 14th, and I'll read the tweet, and we'll put this in the video here. So Donald Trump, quote unquote, "So interesting to see progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, if they even have a functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run. Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came? Then come back and show us how it is done. These places need your help badly. You can't leave fast enough. I'm sure that Nancy Pelosi would be very happy to quickly work out free travel arrangements." So that's the tweet, and spurned a huge, controversy, and a lot of people think this is a blatantly racist tweet. So, Jason, I'll throw it open to you. Do you think this is a racist tweet?
I think the term racist is a very difficult term to decipher in all cases. I looked up how does Wikipedia define it. Racism is the belief in the superiority of one race over another. It may also include prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone because they are of a different race or ethnicity, or the belief that members of different races or ethnicities should be treated differently. Okay? So
Okay.
I think I don't know if it's an identifiable example of racism. I think it's tone deaf and provocative, and if you're sensitive to racist rhetoric, it's extremely provocative, right? So maybe that falls into antagonism. Uh,
That's a key word, I think, from that definition is antagonizing. That could be, I view this as could be very antagonistic of other races.
yeah. Um, but at the same time, I think there's distinctions to be made between racism or xenophobia or patriotism. Um, there's a difference between being a racist or there's a difference between what country you come from and your race identification, so to speak. Um,
True.
I also I think if anyone is really sane about the issue, they recognize, as far as science shows us, we all come from Africa.
Right.
So people who have really strong beliefs about race, I think are often colored by their life experiences or their lens of the world. But I think, unfortunately, that's not that's not the ideal or actual reality I'd love us all to be at. And I mean, I understand it, right? I understand discrimination and just the community effects and individual effects that systematic racism has. Um, I think part of what's going on in this dynamic here is that many on the Democrat side like to view almost any political debate through the lens of racism or xenophobia or discrimination or inequality. And the Republican side likes to not address anything in those terms. And
Yeah.
so there's this kind of no man's land in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Um,
That's a real key point, I think. So there's both sides completely view things very differently. And I think that's well said that the Democrats usually will kind of look for where is the systemic racism, which I think most people would say, historically has existed or does exist in some form in a lot of parts of the country, or some would argue in the country completely. If you look at the prison population is highly more minority, and that can be drawn from systemic racism or just even the black population having been slaves and growing up in more low income areas that has led to more people in that population being incarcerated for drug crimes and everything else that can absolutely be viewed as systemic racism. But your point on how the parties view things, I think, is super key. Republicans and people on the right, I agree with you, almost, it's funny to say that, almost never try to view anything through a racial lens. So even when you talk about the border, for example, Democrats will look at that through a racial lens of, we're trying to not let brown people into the country, whereas Republicans will say, no, we don't even care about the race issue. We're talking about the rule of law and whether a country should have borders, and we don't even want to talk about that there's a racial component to that, when there is. On both sides of those issues, there's a case to be made that you should look at it through one lens or the other, but both sides are almost looking at it through a completely different lens. And that's, as I said before, they're just talking past each other completely because they're almost talking about two different things. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're talking past each other for sure. I agree with that. I also think that we're in a hyper partisan environment. But I remember a lot of racial charges being levied at George W. Bush, especially after Katrina. But again, we've discussed this in other podcasts or recordings. The level of adversarial journalism and fake news directed towards Trump it's like from midnight until midnight. It does not stop, right? And it's
Well, he gives them plenty of opportunity and plenty of ammunition. So this is kind of another great, example of it. So, what I would take from this tweet, I would say Donald Trump wasn't. I don't know. He stokes racism, is what I would say. I think whether he's a racist or not, I am very wary to say that somebody thinks this or believes this because we don't know what's in anybody's heads. And so, a lot of people may say, well, you can tell by his actions that he's racist.
When did the racist accusations against Donald Trump begin?
Well, I mean, day one, I would say. I mean, day one,
what is like
his announcement speech. I mean, even you could probably go back further than that. I mean, he arguably him calling out Barack Obama and trying to say that he probably wasn't born in the United States was a huge factor in really climbing up the popularity ranks among a lot of people on the right. That was huge. He was all over the media for weeks with that issue and going on Fox News and The View and every show he could go on to saying that. And a lot of people would view that as Donald Trump saying that's a racist component because he's trying to say the first black president in the country's history wasn't born here and is not an American, is what he's really saying. And whether he's saying that, he wasn't blatantly saying that because he was black, but it can certainly be interpreted that way by a lot of minorities in the black community, that the reason he was doing that was because he's the first black president. So, I mean, he's troped into these issues very willingly and very befuddled in my opinion a lot of times. So, and he's been unabashedly unapologetic about it.
I mean, I think almost all major political actors in the United States engage in political demagoguery as strategic campaign tools to use personal attacks to try to vilify or polarize their opponent.
Yeah.
Right. And do this in the most severe and scathing terms possible.
So there's degrees, right?
There's openings that present themselves on the campaign trail, like not presenting your birth certificate or having unanswered questions about legal forms, things like that, right? So
yeah, not everybody really has to do that, though. I mean, we don't usually ask for birth certificates from other presidential candidates, right? Like, it's not a thing like show your tax returns and also show us your birth certificate. That's almost never done. Now, you could argue it in Obama's case, since his father was from Kenya, that maybe that leads a little more questions for that opening to be asked.
I think there were legitimate questions. The reality is once any professional investigation was conducted, you quickly, within a reasonable amount of time, realize that there was enough evidence that he was born in Hawaii to not drag out that accusation. There wasn't enough evidence supporting that he was born in Kenya or Canada or some
Indonesia.
Right. And also, of course, the argument can be made, why was this really not a central topic with Ted Cruz, although then it became one, right? That Ted Cruz was born in Canada. So this political demagoguery, again, it can be seen through the racial lens, and I admit he opens himself up to that all the time. He's extremely insensitive to an extremely sensitive topic. He uses it for his political advantage when a lot of people would want to view it as an opportunity to bring healing to the country. Right. And so, I think those are all fair accusations to make. But to say that it's outright racist, I do struggle to. I think there's like a racial sensitivity or outright racist, and I just really don't see it. I frankly don't really see it, and I know that's not the popular view, and I know like half of the people who view this are going to want to send me death threats now, but like I would like to see specific examples of Trump's racism.
So I guess there's degrees, right? Degrees of maybe racism. So like, the question is, does Donald Trump believe that the white race is superior to minorities or the black race or Mexicans or whatever? And I think a lot of people definitely in the Democratic Party would probably say, yeah, absolutely. He definitely thinks that. Has he ever said that blatantly? No. He'll tout, I'm hanging out with Kanye today, or Kanye's coming to the Oval Office and he's a Trump fan, this and that, so I don't think he would ever blatantly say that. What I think Trump does, though, is very, very much what you said, is he makes a demagogue of these issues, and he loves these issues that will really separate white America and like a white working class American in like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those kind of, Rust Belt states, Midwestern states. And he loves to separate people out and inflame and make the other side upset at things that he says. He loves it when the Democrats are upset at things that he says, because he knows his side that supports him will be further enthralled and love that he's making them upset. So it's interesting. I was listening to this podcast with Eric Weinstein and Joe Rogan recently, and Eric Weinstein had a pretty interesting analogy towards this kind of thing. He said, basically, if somebody, like, let's just say somebody had hurt your child, right? And somebody went and hurt them and beat them up, right? You would almost kind of, you wouldn't necessarily think that was the right thing to do, that person beating up that person that hurt your child was correct in just blatant violence over that. But you would almost kind of sympathize with them and like mentally give them a bit of a pass in your own mind. And that's where I think Trump supporters maybe like that he's taking on the left or the liberal congresswomen, because they don't like them over their views. Maybe a lot of them don't like them due to their race too. I think there's probably a good fraction of supporters that maybe are blatantly racist and they fall into that category.
What do you think that percentage is, Brett?
Couldn't tell you. I don't know, but I think it exists, certainly.
Can you give a guess?
Of all Trump supporters,
how many of them do you think are racist?
Yeah, I would say probably at least 5% are racist. 5, maybe more, and then we're going to get into what level of racism are they? Do they not believe in any affirmative action? Do they believe that they're racially superior? There's all kinds of distinctions I think people will make and will justify in their heads. But I think, yeah, there's certainly. Do you think there's any fraction or percentage of Trump supporters
that's about the percentage I would have assessed to, about 5%, maybe slightly more.
Now I'm talking like a blatant racist. I'm talking somebody that believes that whites are superior, or they don't want to help the minority.
Yeah, they've got a form of like hatred or racism in their heart. But I would also say that it's probably a similar percentage on the Democrat side, right? It's not covered or as paid attention to as much, but I do think there's like a lot of white hatred, for example. That's racism, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly very plausible as well. yeah, we can go a lot of places with that topic. Here's one thing I'll say though, getting back to Trump's tweet. So this is, one of the things, he leads himself open to this kind of criticism because he's trying to say that these four congresswomen should go back to where they came from, right? And three of these congresswomen are born in the United States. Ilhan Omar was born in Somalia, right? Pretty sure.
Yeah, came here when she was 10 or 11, something like that.
Yeah, she's an American citizen. But here's, an issue where Trump kind of plays very fast and loose with the truth, or just completely gets things wrong, frankly, and says, hey, they should go back to where they came from. And this is where I think people can really label this as kind of a racist tweet, because three of them are born in the United States. So where are they going back to? Are they going back to where their parents were from? We can have disagreements in the United States and say that we think the government should be run better or run differently without trying to say, well, you need to leave altogether. If you're critical of the government or how things are run, that doesn't mean you need to leave the country, right? We can all disagree. Donald Trump spent, years criticizing Obama and the way the government was run. Does that mean if he didn't like it, that he should have moved back to Scotland or, Germany, or wherever his family's from? I don't even know, somewhere in Europe, because he didn't like the way Obama was running the country. So I think it's a pretty ridiculous thing to say, honestly, to say, go back to where you came from, to people that are either American citizens or are born in the United States and are full Americans. We all of our, what's that?
They're members of Congress.
Right. What's that have to do with?
Yeah, no, I mean, they're not just Americans or American citizens. And I mean, I get it. It's extremely disrespectful. It's engaging in a strategy to win a political debate. It's politically advantageous to do this type of thing. I also do think, frankly, that
do you think it's politically advantageous? That's so. Clarify that a little bit. Like, how is this politically advantageous to Trump?
I think what he's doing. First of all, I think there's a symbiotic thing going on. I think it's advantageous to the squad too, to be punching up to the president. I believe all four of them are freshman members of Congress.
I think so.
Right, and two of them are members of the Democratic Socialist Party, I think. So to kind of boost their status in the Democratic Party is good for them and good for Donald Trump, right? So it's mutually beneficial in that respect. And he's also creating this dichotomy of, they're saying you're a racist, sexist, and not my president, and he's saying they hate America. And I think both of them are politically rewarded for engaging in those types of rhetorical battles.
Yeah. And this is kind of where I, really grit my teeth and really look for somebody that can bring us past these kinds of issues, because Donald Trump is basically, as what you're saying, and I agree with you, is using issues like this to try to demagogue and build himself up with his own base. He's not looking to really reach across the aisle and bridge divisions. And right now we're kind of in this social media era.
I would kind of disagree with that. Can I interrupt for a second there?
Go ahead.
On that point, I mean, we're talking about someone who was a business Democrat for many years, right? Donald Trump was a business Democrat in the 80s and 90s. It wasn't until, I think, around Obama that he switched.
Speak up a little bit.
Yeah, okay.
It's hard to hear you.
But, one thing that we almost never hear on the news is Black and Hispanic unemployment at historic lows. If it was any other president who wasn't subjected to such political demagoguery about being a racist, it would be national news. We'd be so proud that finally these communities who suffered for generations are getting economic opportunities. They don't say a word about that, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of political unfairness. There's also the Second Chance Act that Trump passed. There's a lot of things that just fly in the face of claims of racism. He's actually taking action. Now, I understand rhetorically, but I would equate it to the Squad. They're both engaged in the same type of rhetorical political gamesmanship, right? But if you look at their actions, I don't see real substance to claiming that Trump is a racist. Now, if you look at recent American history, right, in 2016, Trump received 8% of the African American vote, according to the New York Times. Okay, in the midterm election, it was 9% for the GOP, according to the New York Times. I would be willing to wager money that in 2020 he does a lot better than either of those numbers.
You think so?
Yeah. Would you like to wager any money on that?
That could be a good wager. Yeah, I'll wager on that. So 9% is
well, he did 8%. I would like to draw the line there, I would think, but
at 8%.
We could do it at 8.5% and so over 8 wins.
Okay. Yeah, I'll go on that with you for sure.
So if it's 8 or
$100 bucks, $100.
$100 for 2020. We gotta catalog of this on the blog or something.
Yeah. All right. Fair enough. We'll do that.
$100.
So yeah, $100. I think he does worse than 8.5% is the bet, right? I want to confirm let me caveat this that I want to confirm those exit poll numbers that's what he got.
It's also hard to. It's going to be hard to determine exactly those numbers. That was according to. I could find the article in the New York Times that referenced those statistics.
Yeah,
those statistics actually are hard to determine.
Well, there was the huge exit poll numbers that came out, and those are actually fairly easy to pull up because I think all the organizations basically kind of go in together on those exit polls. And I was actually just looking at this the other day for a commenter on our podcast here. So yeah, we'll be able to pull those up, and those are. I'll probably be able to find it right now, actually. Yeah, I have it here. So based on race, yeah, you were dead on. Trump got 8% of the black vote is what they're saying.
What's the source?
Just the CNN exit polls. I think the exit polls, I believe.
News organization?
What's that?
Is that a news organization?
CNN?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think these exit polls are done in conjunction with all the organizations. This is just the one that I was able to pull up because they have it laid out nicely. But I think I may be mistaken on this. I think all the news organizations, so maybe AP, NBC, CNN, they all go together to do one big exit poll. So this is based on 24,558 respondents in the election for the exit polling data. So
we're pretty much committed to that percentage, but what we should do is try to verify the data sources and what we agree upon. I don't think we're going to shift much, but it would be nice to, of course.
Yeah, we can reconfirm how the exit polls are done. So yeah, with the exit polling, so I just pulled up as well the Fox News exit polls, and so completely different news organization with a different point of view, probably more amenable to the president, and they have the exact same numbers, 8% for the black vote for Donald Trump. So and just to let you know, so I think I'm correct on this, that the number of respondents was almost exact. I think the same, 24,558. So I believe all the organizations pool their resources. What's that?
How weird. I wonder how they do that.
I think this is just my guess, is they're stationed all around the country, right? So to get an accurate representation, they're probably, taking X percentage in rural parts of the country, X percentage in cities, to try to make it as representative of what the real vote is going to be as possible.
24,000 such a small number.
Not compared to a lot of polls, though. So, like, I think if you look at a lot of just regular presidential polls, you'll see those in the thousands, like 4,000 or 5,000 people.
I think it would be awesome if this stuff was transparent and available to the public, and we didn't have to rely on intermediaries to get this data.
Well, I mean, it is transparent to the public. I mean, we're pulling it up right now.
Polls are, but they're being filtered through corporate media entities. I'd love to actually have from our government exactly who self-identifies as what and who you voted for. I think that would be good for everybody. And you can abstain if you want to, but it would be good to have more information.
So you want the government to ask as you're voting. I think a lot of people would find this a little bit problemsome. Just like we just had a citizenship question debate over whether the government should ask, "Are you a citizen or not?" on the census, right? So if you have a ballot that says, "Are you Black, white, Hispanic, da da da," check here. Who are you voting for? Check here. Do you think a lot of people will trust that to be giving that information to the government?
Or you can refuse to. You could have a box that says choose to not answer.
Yeah, fair enough. I
actually think I've said this before in other topics. In a democracy, in a representative democracy, they're more healthy when people are informed about actual reality, and not getting sound bites from people with agenda.
Yeah, but I think I agree if you can come up with a process and to release that data, and that's basically a lot of the role that the government does is collect data and then share that with the public, right? As long as people aren't manipulating that are in power. So if Donald Trump's in power and, he has some, demographic that polls higher or votes higher, and he's releasing that, but not releasing the stuff that hurts him,
it's not too far-fetched to think in the next decade that something like blockchain technology can be created to verify the votes, and if you change any part of it, the entirety of it would be altered, and so therefore you can't manipulate it because every bit of code is resting on itself. Something like that, I think, would be beneficial for us to make informed decisions about who feels represented in what ways. I find it just like amazing that 92% of any community would vote in one direction. That tells me that there's an extreme communication breakdown. That 92% of any demographic group voting for one political party, I would argue, like, I would be very interested in what benefits that community is getting from doing that. And I would think that if there was a more equal representation in the parties, that the communities would be better served.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. I could argue that pretty easily, I think. The Black community basically, was more Republican after Lincoln, emancipated the slaves. But then during the New Deal and FDR, they pretty much switched over to the Democratic Party just due to the social programs that FDR was implementing to, help them through Social Security. And then you have Lyndon Johnson expanding and implementing Medicare and Medicaid, which could be greatly seen to help the low-income community, which would be more represented by minority communities and the Black community. So, we can go on and on there. That I agree that it's certainly a huge communication breakdown, and maybe it's also a policy breakdown too on the Republican side to not, focus on race issues as much as the Democratic Party. And those issues and minorities are going to vote for people that focus on those issues more so. I do want to get back, though, to what you were saying about Donald Trump, how that the administration should be seen as less racist than maybe they are by people on the left. And I do want to, you kind of highlighted but sidestepped over very quickly, the the Second Chance Act. Is that what it was called? The Prison Reform Act. I mean, that's a huge piece of legislation that is going to greatly help the different minority communities in the country. I mean, I was just reading an article.
Systematic racism for
Yeah.
generations.
Yeah, and he should get some credit for that. And I mean, even people like Cory Booker have been, voted for that, and were very excited to vote for that act, and had been wanting some type of legislation for, a decade plus to be passed to help out with these people that have been put away and incarcerated for, drug crimes and things of that nature. So that they're just starting to release a lot of those people back into society, and it's in the thousands. The Wall Street Journal article that I read last week said roughly about 3,000 people were, going to be released. So that's a pretty huge thing to do to retroactively release people, and moving forward, treat those crimes differently, to not incarcerate as many people in minority communities.
Not just that, it's also $100 million every year to help reduce recidivism rates, to help people pay their first and last month's rent when they get out of jail, so that they can have a home. Because if you have a job, you really don't need to mug anybody. But part of the problem is there has been systematic racism in America. You have to be blind to not see it. Again, I think there's a difference in perspective on how people view the world and how pervasive it is. I also think, and it goes back to this fight between the Squad and Trump, very few people in the United States would choose to live anywhere else. We are so blessed to live in this country. And, it is messy, and it's a political experiment for humanity that's only a couple hundred years old. Humanity's tens of thousands of years old. And I think anyone would be foolish to not recognize how awesome it is to be an American. And the flip side of that is where the Squad comes in, I think. And if they're viewed more charitably, you'd recognize that they're trying to have scrutiny for America, and with policies that they disagree with, or to voice their political opinion, whether it's a more socialistic perspective or anti-war perspective. And I think in an American democracy, those types of dichotomies, even if sometimes they're vicious rhetorical battles that are counterproductive, overall, that political dichotomy is very productive for a healthy United States. We should be battling about these issues. And I think if we can take a step back emotionally, we can recognize that actually this is America working through a long-term historical process that I think everyone would agree to varying degrees. We're getting better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point you're bringing up, that, America's only, a couple hundred plus years old, and this is kind of an experiment that's been tried, and, it's new, and we're still working through it. And that kind of also...
What's your ethnicity? How did your family come to America?
Well, I mean, I'm part Spanish. I have some Native American in me, Northern Europe, etc. So I'm like 15% Native American, like 40% Spanish Iberian Peninsula. But yeah, I mean, yeah.
That's so awesome. And my family was like running from Adolf Hitler to find somewhere where they could live and be free.
Yeah.
And escape the Holocaust to come here. Again, it's awesome. And when I look at African Americans or any American, it's pretty awesome to see the experiment that we're trying to do imperfectly, but man, we're so blessed to live in this country, and we need to refresh that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well said. I think it also kind of it almost gives credence to what the Squad's saying too, though, because that idea is saying that, hey, we're just trying to figure out this system, and so why not try to do more? Why not try experiments like potentially free college, and we can get into that on another podcast. But those kind of ideas, or universal health care in different ways, right? Other countries provide it. How can we, as America, do that in a good way? And so when people kind of get into this whole, well, we've never done it that way, therefore we shouldn't do that, or we've never, had universal health care in America, therefore we should never have it. I think that's a really short-sighted argument, because the reality is our entire system has been an experiment from, day one, and we're still evolving policies as we go through time. And to look at any one policy and say it's going to lead to an end of America or a way of life or whatever is probably gravely mistaken. As Warren Buffett always says, I'm living better than my parents lived. They live better than their grandparents, and my children are going to live far better than me. So human progress and living in America is probably
what you're
better.
describing is the distinction between progressives and conservatives, right? And it's that kind of tension that I think creates healthy advancement. It's conservatives saying, we need to address this issue before we jump in with both feet. We need to make sure we understand the landscape. And it's progressives saying, we've got a problem, we've got to address it. And if that debate can be constructive and ultimately, pro-American or pro-humanitarian, that's an awesome tension to have.
Yeah, there's Jordan Peterson has a pretty good line about this. He says, conservatives and people on the right are very much into a hierarchy and trying to say, no, we need to organize society. And naturally, they believe that there's a hierarchy that exists. So there's people on the top and there's people on the bottom. And that you have to have that in order to have a functioning society. So you have to have leaders at the top of the structure that are making rules for, people more on the bottom, and you have to have a hierarchy. Whereas people on the left are there to say, we want to make sure that the hierarchy isn't getting corrupt. And they're there to point fingers at the top of the hierarchy and say, are you guys acting in the best interests of everybody here? And their role is to just highlight that and make sure that the hierarchy is not delving into self-promotion and corruption, basically. So, I 100% agree. It's weird because I I think you've really enunciated. Maybe you're changing me to some extent on this issue, but I didn't think this was a good conversation to have, and I probably still don't overall. I don't think that Trump has been productive in this matter, but maybe it's good to just have these kind of discussions so that people know that we are taking note of them, and that minority communities are being heard, and Trump is being kept accountable by this conversation too, to make sure that he's aware that it's inflaming for minorities to hear these kinds of words. I would still prefer somebody to bring us all together more so and bridge the divides, but point taken on some of the policy stuff, but maybe it's a good conversation to have.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. This is, to live in a country where we're free to be able to talk about these topics. And I think not to toot our own horn, but it takes a little bit of courage to not only talk about these topics, but to do it on a recording that's going to be posted on the internet, right? But we should have that courage. And if I've misspoken or something, let's try to understand what the context behind what I was trying to communicate, instead of jumping on a snippet like people have a tendency to do and claiming someone's a racist or someone hates America or something. And I think that this is I'm glad we did this. This is, it's uncomfortable for sure.
Yeah. And, I don't know that we're going to necessarily make the either side happy with the discussion. I don't know that we're really bridging the divide here between it, because I think the minorities and the squad and people on the left, progressives, can view Trump's tweets. I guess I didn't get to part of the intent of this. So that's one thing I did want to hit on with Trump. So I don't think, you could argue whether you think Trump's a racist or not, right? I'm very wary to put labels on people because I think it's very difficult to know what's in somebody's heart and head. But what I think Trump's intent here, I don't think Trump was necessarily trying to go into this and saying, I want to stoke flames and demagogue race issues with this tweet. I think Trump basically saw a fight between the squad and Nancy Pelosi and 100% just said, hey, how can I inflame a division between the squad and Nancy Pelosi? I think that was Trump's number one intent with this tweet. I don't think his intent at all was to provoke race issues. In fact, on our earlier points, I think he is so racially insensitive in the respect that he doesn't think about that. Like if he doesn't take into account whether it's going to be a racial issue at all. So whether it may or may not be, he's going to say it anyway. His number one intent was to inflame Nancy Pelosi versus the squad and how best to do that. And this is the way that he chose to do that. But that intent is just to win politically, right? It's trying to break the left apart from the moderate left, and your side wins when you do that if you're on the right or the Republican side. So that was his number one intent, I believe.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, it's hard to get away from counter accusations like comments that the Clinton made about super predators, or things that Joe Biden has done as well that have harmed the African American community. And then at the same time, I think his campaign will try to make the argument that there's historic lows. Look at the things that I've done throughout my life and career, and it's going to be contentious. This issue is not going to go away throughout the entire campaign cycle.
It's a good point that you bring up too, because we talked a little bit about Joe Biden and his debate clash with Kamala Harris over busing, and him talking to blatant segregationists and whether that in and of itself is racist. And she had to even come out and say, I don't believe you're a racist, but you're kind of sympathizing with racists, basically. And, the crime bill, that's partly the Second Chance Act is trying to undo parts of, the crime bill. And so does Joe Biden have to answer for that? So I think you're seeing this, race and the question of racism and whether, working with racists or certain policies are helping racist policies or systemic racism in the country. It's a huge topic during this election season, and it's probably a much bigger topic for the Democratic Party right now. And they're gonna have probably a lot of these battles over immigration and these issues that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are fighting over right now. And part of the primary is going to be fought. Maybe it's going to be one of the top 2 or 3 or 4 biggest issues is race and race issues. So I think Donald Trump knows that. And unfortunately, I think he's taking advantage of that. And he's throwing out this material like this to inflame those debates within the Democratic Party. But he doesn't, I don't think he's receptive enough or knows enough that it's also inflaming parts of the country. And your job as president is to, try to bring the country together instead of inflaming racial divides. And granted, he's trying to do it because he wants the Democratic Party divided, but it's not overall helping the overall country and the debate that we have in the country. Maybe you disagree with that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm definitely sensitive to that argument for sure. I'd only say what it does, hopefully, is it fosters a reanalysis of people's perspectives. I think there's a lot of the country who's now, instead of being silent on these issues, they're shouting patriotic visions of America, and almost like a one America, and to stop seeing everything through the lens of race, while on the other side you have a vision of America that where race and gender inequality and sexual inequality are dominant issues in their viewpoint, or at least that's my interpretation of it, right? And these types of like generational conflicts need to be brought up to the surface. So I think it might be an unintended consequence of the president's tone-deaf rhetoric, or insensitive rhetoric. But it flushes these things out, I think, in a way that allows the general public to start to address them and acknowledge them, be more aware of them. And I think we've seen this with like the gay community a decade ago, right? It was 2 decades ago, and it was extremely unpopular politically to support the gay community.
Gay marriage. Yeah, even Barack Obama didn't support gay marriage until 2012, basically.
Right. So that's less than a decade ago.
Yeah.
Right. So, but I think like for our age group, we saw that change happen right in front of our eyes. And a lot of it happened, I think, because of Hollywood, and because people were flushing these conversations up to the surface. And it was no longer like this silent bigotry that went under the surface. And this might be controversial, but I suspect this is what's happening with the 92% of the African American community that votes Democratic to a large extent. I think there's this like silent, you can't say you're a Trump supporter, or you're going to be ostracized from your community if you're African American. I think, Kanye is a public example of that, but I think it's in any African American dominant community. If you wear a Make America Great Again hat, like, good luck. And so there's this, I think part of and the reason I'm going to win our bet is because this stuff is going to be brought up to the surface, and African Americans are going to feel at liberty to start investigating what are the actual policies, not just the rhetoric of both sides. We understand you're saying this person's racist, but are they actually racist? And maybe being more skeptical. And I think ultimately, whether it takes 2 years or a decade, it's going to be good for America in the long term. At least I'm hopeful for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hopeful view, I think. It's really just funny how people become so tribal with their politics to where they can, some people can look at this tweet and say, no, there's no hint of racism in here. I don't see racism. And then the other side can look at it and say, this is one of the most racist tweets of any president, maybe in modern times, or something to that effect, I hope that you're right, because that's I think you're taking a hopeful view that these conversations are going to lead to a better place. It's funny, though, that, when you're talking even about the gay marriage example, for instance, that when we do have these conversations, they tend to shake out to a more progressive nation. Don't you think that's kind of interesting? That
America's a progressive nation. It is. Politically, we've had the pendulum swings back and forth, but from our revolution, we've been very progressive.
I don't know. I could argue differently. I mean, we had slavery in this country for
true
80 plus more years after the American Revolution, even after
more than Europe. Yep.
Yeah, I just got done reading. I think I mentioned to you. George Washington biography by Ron Chernow. And, Washington struggled with the slavery issue, but in his will, he said to emancipate in his will every slave that he owned outright. And it's very complex because he was the executor of like his children's estate, who were not his. They were Martha's husband, previous husband. But Washington had to oversee that. But under law, like Martha had, you know, money and her property, slaves, etc., that she fully owned, that Washington had to help oversee, and even her children and grandchildren under law had that, and Washington couldn't emancipate those slaves because he didn't technically own them. But in his will, he said to emancipate all the slaves that he owned outright, because he struggled with setting them free for decades. It's funny that it's crazy, amazing, and horrifying that even after all that, we still had slavery in this country for 80 plus more years. So, you know, we've been a progressive country in some respect, but we've also been super incredibly slow to move. I mean, take the gay marriage thing, for example. You know, we've had, you know, discussions on gay marriage for decades, right? And, you know, it took basically the Supreme Court. We couldn't even pass that, you know, through the Congress or through signed by the president as a law. We had to get the Supreme Court basically to overturn that, as so many times in history with like the Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court has to step in and be the progressive player to take the long view and the right view of history and push America to do the right thing. So, you know, I think it's just interesting that a lot of these debates end up being coming down on the more progressive side, and we should probably take note of that, you know, as we're debating these issues, that in the long term, you know, maybe we're going to end up more on the progressive side than on the other side of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are great points. Yeah, we're certainly not a perfect country, that's for sure. But again, I would say it's very hard to think of anywhere else on earth I'd rather
So, question. So, like on this note, and we can get into this maybe on other podcasts, but I'll just throw out there that, you know, things like Medicare for all, universal health care, or free college to everybody, that maybe can meet some kind of criteria to pass to get into it or something to that effect. These kinds of ideas that progressives are really throwing around, I would say that, you know, there's other countries that do forms of these kinds of things. And for, I don't know what, you know, I think for anybody to sit there and say, well, because we haven't had this kind of system before, or because I had to pay for college, I don't think, you know, my son should be getting free college just because I didn't, you know. I think that's very short-sighted and kind of almost looks down on an evolution and human progress and progressive policies that we can achieve in the country. So I kind of think that these conversations are good to discuss and good to see how can we maybe implement some of these things. Because at the end of the day, you have to admit that what, you know, maybe what the squad or some of these progressive candidates are arguing for, you know, wiping out student debt, free college for everybody that maybe can qualify or pass you know, the ability to get in or whatnot. Those are good things, right? Like, they would be amazing if we could actually do those kinds of things in this country and get those off of the plate and the costs off of the plate of the average American or lower income American. And if they didn't have to pay for healthcare for themselves, or really bad high deductible health insurance policies that people are having to pay for thousands of dollars out of pocket and really can't afford. If they didn't have to pay for that, they'd use their money for other things, right? Maybe they'd use it to start businesses, or if they have a business, maybe they'd hire another employee or two. So I think it's worth thinking about and giving credence to the idea that maybe we're going to end up on these progressive policies in 10 or 20 years anyway. And it's worth discussion, worth debating right now to have.
Yeah, again, it's that healthy tension, right, between progressive ideas of how we can improve our society, but also this conservative tension to not want to jump in with both feet. And then, of course, you know, the world is extremely complex, and in the aftermath of World War II, the geopolitical landscape and our role militarily throughout the whole globe, and the drain on our resources that creates. I mean, there's so many complexities, but having that, having these discussions are great. And so again, like, I applaud. I don't agree with all of the positions that the squad puts forth or some of the rhetoric that they use, but I love what they're bringing to the surface. And in a sense, while I think there's like hatred towards them, people like viscerally hate this group of people, I think there's the same type of hatred towards Trump. And I actually have this like love for Trump, because in his own imperfect ways and often insensitive ways, just like the other side could be criticized as well, he's bringing super important issues up to the surface. And while it's uncomfortable for our country at the moment, much like having this conversation might be for us, I think this is the type of thing that fosters healthy debate, progress, and is good in the long term, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'll agree with that, and just kind of put a couple policy things down to maybe get close to closing up here. Is like the things you're saying Trump's bringing up. I agree. So, making an issue of China and stealing intellectual property and whatnot. No other president really put the effort into that. Taking on, a hollowing out of the manufacturing base in the country and still the steel industry in the country, things like that. Now, you can argue whether that's good or bad and going to help some of these industries anyway, but just the fact that he's bringing that up, or whether other countries are, footing their bill in NATO, or whether other countries should take more of a role and pay for, policing the Strait of Hormuz near Iran. Why are we doing it? Trump asks, when we don't need really that much oil from there anymore. We're producing a lot of our own. So these are all things that, and like the Second Chance Act, these are things that a lot of other presidents haven't really brought up that is at least good to talk about. And, he's bringing these issues up. So let's applaud him for that, as much as some of his tone deafness we can chastise him for, I guess.
Well said. Yep, I agree.
Anything else, Jay? I think that may be a good spot to leave it.
So we've got the bet book, though, right?
We're going to start a bet book. We'll put it on a blog. We'll put the bet on a blog. We'll keep a bet blog. Actually, let's do that. Bet number 1, 2, 3. We'll do a bet blog.
It's a great idea.
Perfect. All right. This has been Civil Disagreements with Jason and Brett. Thanks for watching. Let us know any comments, and be nice, everybody, please.
Thanks, Brett.